Forget the heroic death you saw in Braveheart. Forget that defiant, last-gasp cry of freedom. The real execution of William Wallace wasn't a noble end for a warrior. It was a meticulously planned, multi-stage public spectacle of agony, designed by a vengeful king to be the most terrifying punishment he could imagine. What they actually did to him on August 23, 1305, was far worse, far more calculated, and infinitely more cruel than any movie would dare to show. This isn't a story about Hollywood heroism. It's the story of state-sponsored terror. It's about how a king, furious and humiliated by a low-born Scottish rebel, used the full, horrific power of the medieval state not just to kill a man, but to erase him, desecrate him, and turn his body into a gruesome message of absolute power. From the moment he was captured to his final, horrifying moments at Smithfield, we're going to uncover the truth of William Wallace's punishment, a truth that reveals the stark, brutal reality of justice and power in the 14th century. To understand the sheer, calculated brutality of Wallace's end, you first have to understand why King Edward I hated him so much. Not just disliked, hated, with a personal, venomous passion. Edward, also known as Longshanks, was one of the most powerful and ruthless monarchs in English history, and Wallace had become his obsession. The late 13th century was a chaotic time for Scotland. After a succession crisis left the throne empty in 1290, the Scottish nobles, terrified of civil war, made a fateful mistake. They invited their powerful southern neighbor, King Edward, to choose the rightful heir. Edward, a master strategist, saw his chance. He agreed, but only if every contender first recognized him as the Lord Paramount of Scotland, effectively making Scotland his puppet state. Desperate, the nobles agreed. Edward chose John Balliol as the new King of Scots, but it was a hollow crown. Balliol was a king in name only, constantly undermined by Edward, who treated Scotland like a new acquisition. The humiliation peaked in 1296 when Edward, enraged by a Scottish treaty with his enemy, France, invaded. He stormed the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, unleashing a horrific massacre. He crushed the Scottish army, forced King John Balliol to abdicate, ceremonially ripping the royal insignia from his coat and earning him the nickname Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat, and stole the Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, bringing it back to London. As far as Edward was concerned, Scotland was conquered. The kingdom was no more. It was into this landscape of defeat that William Wallace emerged. He wasn't a great lord or a claimant to the throne. He was the son of a minor landowner, basically a commoner in the rigid medieval world. His rebellion didn't start with a grand political plan, but with an act of raw defiance. After an English sheriff allegedly murdered his wife, Wallace hunted the man down and killed him, igniting a guerrilla war against the English occupiers. What started as local outrage quickly spiraled into a national uprising. Wallace was charismatic, audacious, and a brilliant tactician. He gathered an army of common men and, alongside another resistance leader, Andrew de Moray, achieved the impossible at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. Facing a much larger and better-equipped English army, the Scots used the narrow bridge as a fatal bottleneck, trapping and annihilating the English force. The English treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, was killed, and in a grisly testament to the hatred felt by the Scots, his body was flayed and his skin cut into strips as trophies. Stirling Bridge was a stunning humiliation for the seemingly invincible Edward I. A peasant army led by a commoner had shattered his professional force. Wallace was knighted, named Guardian of Scotland, and began ruling in the name of the exiled King John. He wasn't just a rebel anymore. He was the de facto leader of a nation. This could not stand. Edward, a king obsessed with his own authority, was incandescent with rage. He had been personally embarrassed by a man he saw as a backwater thug. He gathered a massive new army and marched north to crush the rebellion himself. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Edward's legions of Welsh longbowmen proved decisive. The Scottish spearmen, trapped in their defensive circles, were slaughtered by relentless volleys of arrows. The Scottish army was crushed. Wallace survived, but his military reputation was destroyed. He resigned as guardian and became a fugitive in his own country. For years, he evaded capture, traveling across Europe, trying to rally support for Scotland. But Edward's obsession never faded. While other Scottish nobles were eventually pardoned, Edward made one exception: William Wallace. For him, there would be no quarter, no mercy. The hunt was a personal vendetta that would only end with his capture and a punishment designed to be an example for all time. For 7 years after the defeat at Falkirk, William Wallace was a ghost. He was the most wanted man in Britain, haunting the English occupation of his homeland while other nobles, like Robert the Bruce, played a complicated game of submission and quiet resistance. King Edward I's orders were absolute. Wallace was to be hunted down. The end came on August 3, 1305. Near Glasgow, at a place called Rob-Royston, Wallace was taken. There was no heroic last stand. It was a quiet, pathetic betrayal. A Scottish knight loyal to King Edward, Sir John de Menteith, orchestrated the capture. For this act, Menteith was richly rewarded by the English king, his name forever blackened in Scottish lore as the man who sold out Wallace. Wallace was likely asleep when he was seized, taken completely by surprise. Upon his capture, English soldiers found papers proving his diplomatic efforts abroad, including letters of safe conduct from the kings of France and Norway. These were sent straight to Edward. More proof that Wallace wasn't just some local rebel, but a man who acted on the world stage. A further insult to the king's authority. From Rob-Royston, Wallace began the long, humiliating journey south. This wasn't a quick transfer. It was a 400-mile parade of a defeated enemy. Bound and under heavy guard, he was paraded in a cart through English towns and villages. This was pure political theater. Edward wanted his subjects to see the great Scottish terror, the boogeyman of the Northern Wars, now broken and in chains. He wanted them to see the power of their king. Imagine the scene. Wallace, a man of legendary stature, now helpless as crowds jeered at him in every town. For the English, fed years of propaganda about the savage Scot, this was a spectacle of triumph. For Wallace, it was the start of a long and calculated degradation, a psychological torment meant to break him before the physical torment even began. After weeks on the road, he arrived in London on August 22nd. The spectacle only grew more intense. He was led through streets thronged with a mob desperate for a glimpse of the infamous rebel. The mayor of London and the city's sheriffs formally received him, adding a layer of civic ceremony to his humiliation. He spent his last night in the house of a London citizen, and the next morning, the final act would begin. He would be taken to Westminster Hall, not for a trial, but for a public sentencing where the verdict had been decided years earlier in the mind of a furious king. On the morning of August 23, 1305, William Wallace was marched into Westminster Hall. This was the ceremonial and judicial heart of the English kingdom, a vast, cavernous space designed to project the immense power of the crown. Bringing Wallace here was symbolic. He was being judged by the very power he had defied. He was forced to stand on a bench at the south end of the hall. In a moment of pure, spiteful mockery, a crown of laurel leaves was shoved onto his head. This was a taunt, a reference to English propaganda that claimed Wallace had boasted he would one day wear a crown in that very hall. It was Edward's way of saying, "You wanted to be a king? Here is your crown, you pretender, on the day I destroy you." What happened next wasn't a trial. A trial implies a defense, witnesses, the possibility of being found innocent. Wallace had none of that. This was a show trial, a public reading of his crimes and his predetermined sentence. The King's Justice, Sir Peter Mallory, read out a long list of charges designed to paint Wallace as an absolute monster. First and foremost, he was charged with high treason against King Edward. Then came the others, atrocities against civilians, sparing neither age nor sex, monk nor nun, sacrilege for burning churches, robbery, murder, and outlawry. When the charge of treason was read, Wallace finally spoke. His response has become legendary. While he freely confessed to being an enemy of England, to killing Englishmen, and fighting their king, he was unyielding on the main charge. He declared, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." This was a brilliant legal and political statement. Treason is, by definition, a betrayal of one's rightful king. Wallace's point was simple. He was a Scot, born in Scotland, and he had never sworn an oath of fealty to the King of England. Unlike many Scottish lords, including Robert the Bruce, he had never paid homage to Edward. Therefore, he argued, it was legally impossible for him to be a traitor. An enemy, yes, but not a traitor. The argument was powerful, but completely futile. In the eyes of the English court, Scotland was a conquered land. All Scots were Edward's subjects, and any resistance was treason. The verdict was never in doubt. Wallace was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was then read out, its wording precise and horrific. It detailed, step by step, the fate that awaited him. For treason, he would be drawn from Westminster to the place of execution. For robbery and murder, he would be hanged. Because he was an outlaw, he would then be disemboweled while still alive and his entrails burned before his eyes. And finally, for his crimes against the church, his body would be beheaded and chopped into 4 pieces. His head would be stuck on London Bridge, and his limbs sent to the 4 corners of his world, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, as a warning. With the sentence passed, the machinery of state-sanctioned torture kicked into gear. The first part of the punishment was the drawing, a procession designed for maximum pain and public humiliation. Wallace was taken from Westminster Hall, stripped completely naked, and tied to a hurdle, a simple wooden panel, like a fence gate, that offered no protection from the ground. With his feet fastened to this frame, he was tethered to the back of a horse. The procession began, its destination Smithfield, a livestock market outside the city walls known for public executions. The distance was just over 2 miles, but the route was likely made longer and more circuitous to maximize the spectacle. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through London's rough, cobbled, and filth-covered streets. Try to imagine the reality of this. With every lurch of the horse, Wallace's naked body was dragged and bounced across the uneven stones. His skin would have been scraped raw, collecting an excruciating number of cuts and bruises. This wasn't just about getting him from point A to point B. It was the beginning of the execution itself, a slow, grinding torment meant to weaken him and display his powerlessness to the entire city. And the city watched. The London mob, whipped into a frenzy, lined the streets. They didn't just watch, they participated. Historical accounts describe people throwing filth, rotten food, and stones at his exposed body. They screamed insults. Spectators ran up to whip and beat him with sticks as he passed. This was the state inviting its citizens to take part in the degradation of a helpless man. This journey of pain served Edward's purposes perfectly. It was the ultimate humiliation for the warrior who had once been guardian of Scotland, now dragged through the muck like an animal to slaughter. It was also a terrifying warning. Every person who saw it would understand the price of defying the English king. Finally, it was a way of inflicting so much pain and exhaustion that the victim would already be in a state of profound shock when he reached the scaffold. After what must have felt like an eternity, the procession arrived at Smithfield. A huge crowd was already gathered, eagerly awaiting the day's gruesome entertainment. Wallace was unhooked from the horse, his body a mass of bleeding wounds, and led to the platform where the final, horrific stages of his sentence would be carried out for all to see. At Smithfield, before a jeering crowd, William Wallace faced one of the most brutal forms of execution ever devised. The punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was a carefully choreographed sequence of torture, each step symbolic and engineered to inflict maximum pain while the victim was, for as long as possible, still alive. First came the hanging. But this wasn't the quick, neck-snapping drop we think of today. This was a slow strangulation, and it was deliberately incomplete. A rope was put around Wallace's neck, and he was hoisted into the air. He would have felt the horrifying sensation of asphyxiation, the blood pounding in his head, his vision going black as his body convulsed. The executioner was an expert in this cruel art, knowing the precise moment to intervene. Just as Wallace was about to lose consciousness, he was cut down. He crashed to the scaffold, gasping for air, his body racked with pain, only to be revived for what came next. Now for the drawing, the disembowelment. While still alive and fully conscious, Wallace was held down and emasculated. The executioner used a knife to cut off his genitals, holding them up to the crowd before throwing them into a fire burning on the scaffold. This was the ultimate symbolic humiliation for his treason. Then, the executioner made a deep cut across his abdomen. As Wallace watched, his own intestines were pulled out of his body, slowly and deliberately, and also cast into the fire. He was forced to watch his own insides burn. It's believed a person could remain conscious through much of this, experiencing a level of pain that is simply beyond comprehension. Some accounts even say his heart was the last organ to be removed and held up before him while it was still beating. Only after this prolonged, indescribable agony did something like mercy arrive. At some point during the evisceration, Wallace finally died from shock and blood loss. With his life gone, the final stages of the sentence were carried out on his corpse. The executioner took an axe and severed his head from his body. But it wasn't over. His headless, mutilated corpse was then quartered, hacked into 4 pieces. Sometimes this was done by tying limbs to 4 different horses and having them bolt, literally ripping the body apart. More often, as was likely the case here, it was done with axes and cleavers. What was once the body of William Wallace was now 5 grotesque pieces, a head, and 4 quarters. King Edward I had not just killed his enemy. He had publicly deconstructed him, piece by agonizing piece. But the message wasn't finished. The final act was to turn his scattered remains into a permanent, kingdom-wide monument to the price of rebellion. The death of William Wallace was not the end of his punishment. For King Edward, the desecration was set to continue, transforming Wallace's body into a gruesome, omnipresent political statement. The goal was to ensure he could not be properly buried, mourned, or become a martyr's shrine. He was to be scattered, a permanent and grisly warning. His head was the first piece to be displayed. It was taken from Smithfield, parboiled in tar to preserve it, then impaled on a pike atop London Bridge. This was the main gateway to the city, crossed by thousands of people every day. Wallace's blackened head would have been one of a kind, an unmistakable message from the king. This is the fate of traitors. The 4 quarters of his body were sent on a longer journey. His right arm went to Newcastle upon Tyne, a key English border city that had suffered from his raids. His left arm was sent to Berwick, a town brutally sacked by Edward at the start of the war. His right leg was sent to Perth, a major Scottish administrative centre, and his left leg was sent to Stirling, the site of his greatest victory, a final, brutal insult. By displaying his limbs in the most important towns across northern England and Scotland, Edward made his warning inescapable. You couldn't travel the region without being confronted by the physical evidence of his wrath. But this ultimate act of calculated cruelty spectacularly backfired. In his quest to obliterate Wallace, Edward had inadvertently created a martyr. The sheer brutality of the execution, far from crushing the Scottish spirit, galvanized it. The gruesome stories of his end spread like wildfire. The scattered limbs, meant as symbols of fear, became relics of defiance. Instead of seeing a defeated traitor, the Scots saw a hero who had been savagely murdered for loving his country. Just 6 months after Wallace's execution, in February 1306, Robert the Bruce made his move. He killed his main rival for the throne, John Comyn, and had himself crowned King of Scots. The rebellion Wallace had started, and for which he had paid the ultimate price, now had a king to lead it. Inspired, and perhaps shamed by Wallace's unwavering sacrifice, Bruce took up the fight with a new determination. The war for independence would rage on, but Wallace's death had changed its character. It was now a sacred cause. King Edward I's meticulously planned spectacle of cruelty was a catastrophic miscalculation. His attempt to use the body of William Wallace as a lesson in terror produced the exact opposite effect. By subjecting him to the most agonizing and humiliating death he could devise, Edward hoped to carve a message of fear into the soul of Scotland. He wanted to prove that resistance was futile, but what he actually proved was the boundless tyranny they were fighting against. The execution didn't break the will of the Scots, it forged it into steel. The story of Wallace's suffering became a national epic of sacrifice. The man who was denied a grave was instead given an entire kingdom as his memorial. The rebel King Edward tried to erase became an eternal symbol, not of treason, but of the unyielding fight for freedom. The true legacy of William Wallace isn't found in the sanitized heroism of movies, but in the gruesome reality of his end. It's a stark reminder that power built on fear is fragile, and that trying to destroy an idea by destroying a person is often the very thing that makes that idea immortal. King Edward won the day at Smithfield, but in doing so, he lost the war for the heart of a nation and ensured that William Wallace would be remembered forever. If you want to see more deep dives into the brutal realities of history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. And let us know in the comments. What other historical events have been given the Hollywood treatment, hiding a much darker and more complex truth? Thanks for watching.